So broadcast, that regulatory framework, and is known as the Broadcasting Act of 1999, and it includes the establishment of the broadcast policy that safeguard and strengthening the ethical reporting, the sense of fairness, the sense of making sure that there's plurality of voices, that we don't hear the same odd voice, and that make sure that certain things are reported. If the material is graphic, you can't show certain material without giving a disclaimer, giving a warning to your viewers or listeners, and there's certain material that cannot be broadcast before 10 o'clock. And it really covered all ethics. And it too has a tool for the public in a sense of the broadcasting complaint, BCCSA, where people can actually complain about the content that has been put forward. And it is perhaps one of the most active bodies in terms of looking after broadcasting. You know, people complain about everything. Recently, I heard that there was a complaint for people who are really scared of injection against the SAPC, who were saying those injections are really making them scared and they don't want to see it. So the public really have a right and they have a platform to complain about the work that you produce. And the onus is on you to make sure that with every work that you produce, you make sure that you do it within the guidelines and the codes that are available for you. Because one of the biggest thing, the thing that you can do to put your organization in harm's way with the broadcasting complaint body is to break your editorial policy. So it is very important to understand your editorial policy and read it against the Broadcasting Act to make sure that how you conduct yourself, generally outside the election, how you conduct yourself is in line with those, with the Act, and is in line with your own editorial policy. But along with that regulatory framework that regulates broadcast media at any given time, there is also the Independent Communication Authority of South Africa Act 13 of 2000. How many of you are aware of the role of ICASA? Are there any broadcasters with us who can just briefly tell us what do they know about the role of ICASA during the election? Any takers? Now, I know journalists to be very active and participatory in this process. I'm very disappointed about the level of participation. Any takers on ICASA? Okay, so I will just first, let me just go through the Act itself so that you can understand it. The Act, it really deals with it regulates the broadcasting in the public interest and ensure that there is fairness and diversity of views broadly representing South African society. It regulates telecommunication in public interest and achieves all these objects in the underlying statute that comes with the Act. There's also the Electronic Communication Act, or 36 of 2005, and the aim of the Electronic Communication Act includes to promote conventions and set up legal framework for bringing together the broadcasting, signal distribution, and telecommunication sectors. Regarding the media coverage, the Electronic Communication Act deals with party election broadcast, political advertising on broadcast services, equitable treatment of political parties by broadcasting services during the election period. I just want to touch more on equitable and fairness treatment of political parties. And the regulation, the 48-hour regulation that says you cannot produce election content, electioneering content within 48 hours before the actual day of the election. First, let's start with fairness. Now, fairness, it has to do with making sure that there's plurality of voices. Now, we know that in South Africa, we have a very strong ruling party and other parties enjoy 25% and under. It doesn't matter that we have a very strong ruling party. With the election, you are expected to actually give people access to information. By access to information, you are expected to give parties a fair coverage and equitable coverage, all other parties that are participating. In as far as the municipal election, it will include giving coverage to independent candidates. These are people who you might not have ever heard about them, but they are contesting for the first time. They too have a right to be heard. So how you reach that fairness is very important, because fairness also include giving parties right to reply. So you might have a situation where you have a 30 minutes or an hour a press conference that was done by EFF, but in that hour, EFF spent 45 minutes really going for the ANC, not necessarily stating their policies. It's up to you to ask the ANC if they would like to respond to what EFF has just said for the past 45 minutes, because you must give the right to reply, but also you must give fair and equitable coverage. One of the challenges in the newsroom when it comes to fair and equitable coverage is that a lot of political parties invest a lot of money on strategy to have a lot of gimmicks that will make sure that they get the attention of the media. So it becomes very critical for editors at this time and for you and journalists to ask yourself, is this story really important for the viewer, or is this a gimmick? How am I going to make sure that I don't cover all the gimmicks that are done by one party and forget other parties? Normally, the rule of thumb really is to try and do, the SAPC does this very well, is to try and do all the unveiling of policies. If party is saying this is our election policy and our election agenda, the SAPC will see covering all parties when they unveil their agenda. For people who are online and for people who are in other broadcasting areas, it might be important to have shows where you actually specifically targeting all other voices to make sure that you achieve that very important part of this legal framework, which is achieving the plurality of voices. Another thing that it covers, which is becomes very important, particularly for commercial media in this time of election, the Act deals with advertising, and the onus is often also on the broadcaster to inform parties as to when they are going to be broadcasting their adverts, to also make sure that how they do that is in line with the policy by declaring if there's an advert that is being done and putting it as such. In the area of commercial media, what you want when you're doing that is to make sure that there's clearly a brick wall, a separation between editorial content and advertorial content, that you make sure that every time, if you're doing the work of municipality because they've paid for slots on your station, that you say this is an advertorial. And when you do your editorial, you create a clear wall where you say, now this is an editorial work, there will be no advertorial content in these different slots or in this news program, just to make sure that you create fairness. Are there any questions around the Electronic Communication Act as well as the ICASA Act in terms of broadcasters? Any questions around the Act?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good morning. This is Saya Pierce-Jones from Heart FM News. So I'm very much in favor of what you were saying, that we need to give fair and equitable coverage to everyone. But just here in the Western Cape, I mean, we've got dozens of parties and individual candidates or independent candidates. And it's really a question for us of how do we take all the time that, I mean, the limited time that we have with our news broadcasts and divide that up equally to give everyone kind of a chance. We're not really sure. And this comes up every year, and then we get complaints as well, unfortunately, because the ruling party in this province is the DA. We might have stories about some other news around the city of Cape Town or the Western Cape government, but then we're told by smaller parties that no, this is unfair coverage closer to the elections. But sometimes, we just have to have these people on air. There's no other authority to speak to. So yeah, and I don't know if there are any other radio broadcast people on here that have any advice, because despite you guys having your amazing 24-hour thing, ours is very limited. It's 6 to 6. It's a couple of minutes at the top of the hour, bottom of the hour. That's about it. That's all we have to work with.
Thank you for that. I think it's often Mary. Let me take Mary's input. Mary.
So, Mapi, I just wanted to share that having done election coverage previously with commercial radio stations, one of the ways in which one can handle this particular aspect is in your planning phase. If you look at an issue-related agenda in terms of the coverage proper. So basically, if you're living in a said region, what are the critical issues? And we found that if we looked at issues around poverty, unemployment, issues around water, and so on, and service delivery, so on and so forth, then we found that every party at some stage or another had voice on those particular issues. And by the end of the pre, the during, and the post, we could measure the issues and what each political party influence was in terms of those particular issues. So that's one way in which you can do it on a commercial a radio station that only has a limited set of headline news type headlines on hour or bulletins at the half hour. Obviously, for community radio, it will differ, and we've dealt with that as well previously. And then in terms of public broadcasting, if you go to the first webinar, there's a lot of information. Thanks, Mapi.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. But another idea for a community radio station is that when you do your election planning, create slots where you might call the slots meet the candidate, where you actually are going to be consciously giving, even if it's because it says fair and equitable, it doesn't mean that it should be proportional in any sense, but you must show that you have gone and covered a particular number of independent candidates. I think we all know in terms of resources and the reach, it cannot be all the time when you need reaction to something that has been announced, you say you will first go to bigger parties. You might want to go to smaller parties, include them in how you cover the election. So it all comes down to planning. I mean, we now know we have only 6, how many weeks do we have leading to the election? We have very limited time. You can start planning now because some of the candidates, even though candidate registration has been reopened, it's only going to be reopened for 1 day. You can now start being very specific and say, I'm not going to cover everything because I don't have the reach. If my focus is Heart FM, it's just going to be the city of Cape Town the metro, and then I'm going to cover some few rural areas that are around it. Don't try to be everything to everyone. Be very specific and very conscious about your coverage, because once you clear that this is the big issue that I'm going to cover, I'm going to focus on all municipalities where there were protests. Then you're not going to try to be a national broadcaster. Leave national broadcasting to the national broadcaster. Focus on your key audience and your target market, and that will help with your planning. But trying to be because one of the disservice that the media normally does with municipal election, they tend to sometimes treat municipal elections as if a national election. Try to follow the national and provincial leaders everywhere. Don't go to communities. That's where the story of the election is. Eventually, people are not going to vote for the Premier of the Western Cape. They're going to vote for whoever are the candidate there. So instead of spending your time telling the story of what the national DA is saying or provincial DA is saying, let's dive into the local DA, and then you can get a competitor to respond to that comment that has been done. I know it's difficult with 5 minutes, but election time also gives us an opportunity to have special election shows. And so I would suggest that in your planning, you can start planning special election shows, whether these are shows to give people just basic information of how to cast their vote and their rights around the voting period. But it's really an opportunity to have special shows that you can balance out. Is there any other question around the broadcasting? I would like us to just maybe touch more on the 48-hour rule. And I see I have Isaac with us. Isaac, can you just give us, like, in 2 minutes, some of the challenges around the 48-hour rule that people who are covering elections need to actually consider when they do their planning? Isaac Mina? Is he with us? Isaac? Okay, he's not with us. He can't hear us. But the 48-hour rule, it is very important because politicians, I remember in 1 year, the president offered the public broadcaster an interview a day before the election. And there was a lot of to and fro as to whether to take that or not. Or Isaac, I see you now on. Did you hear my...
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the question, Mapi?
I was saying one of the big issues is when it comes to ICASA is the 48-hour rule, that there should be no electioneering content 48 hours before the election itself. And it's probably the most difficult one for for broadcasters because, politicians don't stop. And what are some of the things that people who are covering election must look out for around the 48-hour rule?
So, in fact, the 48-hour rule doesn't ban coverage, but what it does say for broadcast is that if you broadcast anything in the last 48 hours that would require a right of reply, then you need to get that right of reply within the 48 hours within the same kind of programming that you have. So one can do it, but one should be extremely cautious. So one approach that broadcasters can follow is to do straight on news coverage on those last 2 days and do maybe wraps of the political campaigns and the IEC's preparations, which in any case, I think give viewers and listeners a really good idea of what, or to prepare them to go and vote. So it's just that one should be really careful, because if you don't give a right of reply, then ICASA can actually act against you.
So one of the things that I used to do when I was still in the newsroom was that to ban interview with political leaders within 48 hours, because you never know if you are going to be able to get the person on time to respond. And the person who is responding might decide to throw another salvo where you actually need to get another person to respond. So you put yourself in the situation where instead of giving the voters the final information that they need before they go voting, you are involved in a tennis match where is he said, she said, ding dong, ding dong. So it's very important to safeguard yourself in those 48 hours, because the politicians know how to play those 48 hours. They set out, they plan how they're going to play you. So it is very important that you know that you might likely be forced to be in a situation where you're not giving viewers the information that they ought to have in those last 2 days, but you are busy giving viewers the shouting match between political parties. So that is quite important. Any question around that? Any questions around that? So I've reached my 45 minutes. I just want to then touch on a couple of key frequently asked questions by journalists around this time. And that is, do I need accreditation for voting or counting station? Media representatives do not need a formal accreditation from the ICC to get access to voting and counting station, but they are required to clearly be identifiable as members of the media. So your press card is very important around this time when you go around voting station. And then the other question is the presiding officer obliged to grant me access to a voting station? Access to a voting station is the discretion of the presiding officer, and they're under no obligation to grant the media access or to discuss activities in the voting station. But if you, as a member of the media, you offer view that access has been unreasonably withheld, then it is possible to appeal to the provincial electoral officer. Now, do I need accreditation to or access to the IEC center in Pretoria, which is the Rock, or in any other provinces? Yes, you need that, and it is a tedious exercise. You need to make sure that you do it on time. IEC is going to start to be giving you information on when that is required, on how to apply. Normally the application is online, and then sometimes you needed to go physically to take your pictures and to collect your accreditation. I don't know how they're going to navigate around long queues to collect that accreditation with the COVID, and you actually need to apply early this time, because as you know, there's limitation on the number of people that can gather. The main Rock in Pretoria used to take close to hundreds of people. I don't think they'll be able to take that number of people, so it's going to be very important that you are in touch with the IEC to make sure that you are positioned to be there, because it becomes, as soon as those votes has been cast and the election stations are closed, it becomes the center of attention. That's where you get numbers coming in. That's where you get political party gathering for reaction in terms of how the political parties are performing generally. Who am I allowed to interview at a voting station? Now, with the exception of the presiding officers, no interviews must be conducted by the staff at the voting station. Presiding officers are mandated to discuss voter turnout and arrangement for voting at their state station. Voters and party agents, candidates, and accredited observers can be interviewed, but they need to be interviewed outside the boundaries. So that is very important. When you want to interview voters, you really need to interview those people outside the boundary, as well as the observers. The observers in terms of this election becomes very important, because the observers would give you an idea if the results are going to be contested or not, because they are the first people who get the information on the numbers that are there. Am I entitled to have access to results slips? Although copies of the result slips will not be made available to the media, a copy though is always put on the door or placed outside the door of the voting district. That's a law after the close of counting of ballots, which then enable the media to have access to the result slips. The result will be available through the IEC website as soon as the result has been verified and entered too. So one of the good things that had come with the electoral also code is that now media house have a right to get the results in real time. But that too, you need to arrange with IEC on time to see that you have software and all necessary digital requirements to be able to access that information as it is published in the IEC, as the results are verified and then loaded on the system. I will end there and hand over to Hopewell.